Hey everyone, this is Brian from the Tennis IQ podcast. Josh and I hope that you are enjoying the content and discussions that we put out week after week. If you'd like to support the podcast and help us to continue to produce quality episodes, please visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/tennisiqpodcast/membership. Currently, we have 3 tiers of support: the fan level at $3 per month, the supporter level at $7 per month, and the champion level at $20 per month. Benefits of joining the Tennis IQ podcast community include episode transcripts, participation in book club discussions, and access to monthly masterclasses with me and Josh. For more on these benefits of support, head on over to our Patreon page at patreon.com/tennisiqpodcast/membership. Thank you so much. And now, on to the show.
Hello and welcome to the Tennis IQ podcast. I'm Josh Berger.
And I'm Brian Lomax. And today, Josh and I are going to talk about essentially the training environment that young players go through in their career. And it extends, of course, into the adult career. But we're calling this really from a athlete-centered to athlete ownership is kind of the theme that we're looking at. And we mentioned in our episode on self-determination theory and motivation that one of the basic psychological needs that we have as humans is this idea of autonomy, this ability to have some choice, have some say in the environment and in our lives. And as we look at the development of players, the development of children, this is something that we want to be considering. How do we start to build that in to the training environment over time? Certainly as a young player, a 6-year-old, 8-year-old begins to play tennis, it's probably a bit early to ask them, what do you want to work on? What's bothering you in your game right now? All right, what are some of your favorite drills? You may not have any at that point. You're just beginning, and so there's a lot of kind of telling that goes on and so forth. And we want to develop that over time. So for me, the kind of the inspiration for this episode was I had listened to a few years ago an episode from Dan Abraham's podcast called The Sports Psych Show. And on this particular episode, he had on the director of AFC Wimbledon, so it's a soccer or football club in England, of their youth academy. And he was talking about how they very specifically use this approach in their academy of going from an athlete-centered approach where it may be more directed, more telling, to slowly giving more and more ownership to the players. So that the time that they're 18, they're much more responsible. They can set up their own practices, their own drills. They can solve problems, etc. So I thought that this was a good topic for us, Josh, in terms of, talking to young players. First of all, we want you to begin to want to own more and more of this. And this is a big part of who you're becoming as a human being. I think this is a good one for parents as well, to look at maybe parenting style and how that needs to change over the course of the lifetime. And certainly for coaches and how they want to be interacting with players at different stages of their not only tennis development, but human development and so forth. So what are some of your kind of initial thoughts on this topic?
I think it's a really important topic. I think that there are a number of different areas that an athlete can start taking ownership of. And I think it really is a process, right? I think oftentimes, for numerous reasons, parents or coaches really have more control or ownership over this process in terms of different factors, including who is the coach of the athlete going to be? What does the training schedule look like? What type of tournaments are they going to play? And I think a lot of this makes sense, right? And I think it makes sense in why it sort of is the default state. I mean, generally the parent is the one paying for things. Generally, the parent is the one arranging transportation, driving the athlete generally to training and to tournaments and things of that nature. So it makes sense that some of the logistics would be sorted out by the parent, right? I don't think any of us are expecting a 8-year-old to be arranging all the travel plans for an upcoming tournament. But with that being said, I think that there really are a lot of benefits for an athlete starting to move in this direction, starting to move from the athlete is at the center of the team, where maybe they have their coach and their parents and their sports psychology professional and some of these different pieces, and the athlete just sort of being in the center of it, to the athlete really taking ownership over that process. And I think we can talk about some of the different ways that that can take place and some of the different benefits of that. But I think it really can help the athlete in a lot of ways. I think it is certainly a process, and I think in a lot of ways a natural process that takes place as an athlete matures, gets older, learns more about the sport. But I think that it really can have a lot of benefits. I mean, I think one in particular, when we think about tournaments, and sometimes I see this with athletes that I work with, I'll ask the athlete, what's coming up in terms of their schedule, and they'll sort of defer to their parents, and they'll say, "Oh, well, I'm not sure, what's coming up necessarily, or I think we have that level 5 tournament coming up next month, but I don't really remember when." And I think that when the athlete can take more ownership over different aspects of their experience, then they feel more invested in it. They feel more invested in it. It's not like, oh, I have tennis today. It's no, I'm really taking accountability, taking ownership. I'm investing myself in my tennis project, in my tennis journey. So yeah, those are some initial thoughts, and I think we could talk about some of the different angles of this, but I think it really is an important topic.
Yeah, and I think as you and I, let's just talk about some of the things that you and I hope for when we work with young athletes, and we talked a little bit about this before we started to record. And I think as people are listening, they may see this as part of what they want for their kids as well, and understanding that we want to be able to create an environment that takes a young person from the ages 7 and 8, where they're at a certain level of maturity, all the way till they're 18 to 25. And so to me, in that journey, and I think whether we are working on this specifically or not, Josh, these are some of the things that we hope for our clients, right? That they are able to solve their own problems. And certainly the tennis court is a great place to learn to do that. You mentioned earlier about how, some players on the court look at their boxes and they gesture up there like, oh, what should I do? And the thing is, maybe maybe they haven't been raised in some ways the right environment. Maybe coaches are too controlling. Maybe parents are too controlling, where they feel this need. They always have to look up, as opposed to like a Danielle Collins, who travels basically by herself and there's no one for her to look to, and she solves her problems and takes care of business, which is a little bit more kind of the old school, what we saw more in the 90s and prior. I think we want to help players regulate their emotions on court, and that's certainly a life skill. We want to help them understand what's important, focus on what's important now, what can they control, right? We want them to be responsible for themselves, which I think is exactly what you were just saying, is to take some responsibility for what they're doing, to take some responsibility in scheduling something, right? Learn good habits, and those habits might be around managing their energy, managing their time, how they schedule their day to meet their energy needs and their time needs. And some of that can be around school, can be around training. Can we give them more responsibility there? We want to teach them how to set goals and know how to achieve those. So those, again, these are all things that you and I are working on as like part of our programs, right? We're teaching them to be respectful and kind, to try to lead more with compassion and encourage other people in their lives, to value their character over winning, and in that process, to have healthy definitions of success, healthy definitions of what it means to be competitive, so that character is important. I think we often talk about purpose in tennis, help them develop purpose in life. Maybe tennis is a part of that purpose, helps you develop yourself. We can talk about living with courage, living in gratitude more, having them be more curious about the world, ask questions, try to understand how things work, right? So when you and I have conversations with people, it's probably, very much a dialogue. You might ask questions, they may ask questions. That's fantastic. We want them to be curious. And I think through that process, we hope that players begin to develop some wisdom, throughout the lifespan. There's nothing more like satisfying to me, Josh, than hearing a player come back to me with like some little bit of insight that they have figured out. And I was like, yes, that is so right on, good. And that now they have that, and then they can move forward. And so there's a lot there, and I think that's, again, we may not be explicitly saying, hey, these are the things that we want to work on with you, but sort of under the covers, this is what's happening. Some of these are explicit, but our process is meant to go through that. And I think also the parenting process, the coaching process, all contributes to these types of things. And so if this is like kind of the end state, with the end in mind, then we have to understand, all right, how do we interact with our player over that lifespan so that these things can, be the result? And it becomes more difficult if we're constantly controlling and solving problems and always directing what is happening. A lot of this becomes more difficult. It's harder to solve problems. Maybe you don't regulate your emotions so much because there's always somebody there to rescue you from these things. So I think when we think about, as coaches and even as parents, what is that end state? Can we start with the end in mind and then kind of reverse engineer how we want to do this? Because I think that's where that athlete-centered approach to athlete ownership approach can be really helpful in structuring how we approach our player over their lifespan. And as they get better and better, that may be a factor as well.
I think that's absolutely right, and I think you brought up a great point that, yeah, if an athlete is not taking ownership, if they're just more so at the center with some of these other people around them, then then they can certainly let things slip, or almost like have somebody rescue them in some of these moments, right? Where, oh well, I wasn't at my best today, and oh, I'm yelling at my box, or things like that, or oh, I didn't bring my extra pair of shoes, and I got a hole in my shoes, and that I guess my parents should have brought it for me, right? Or oh, I didn't bring I was in a long 3-set match and I didn't have any sort of snack or any sort of nourishment, and why didn't my parent bring it, or why didn't my coach mention that instead of the athlete thinking it through? Again, we've talked about Winning Ugly, and there's the book Winning Ugly, and there's an entire chapter on this topic of how to pack your bag, with the idea that it probably won't win you a match, but it could prevent you from losing one. But I think, as an athlete grows and matures and learns more about the sport, and, has goes through this sort of trial and error process, and, hopefully learns from each experience that they hopefully can make better and better decisions, right? They have that match where they didn't pack their bag properly and they didn't bring the extra water and the extra snacks, and then next time around they do, right? Where if the parent is always the one taking charge of that, then then they never learn. um and I think I think none of what Brian and I are trying to do in this episode is to try to tell anybody what to do, right? We understand that people have their own systems, and their own circumstances, and that's all very fair. But I think the idea is, can we find ways to start moving a little bit in that direction? Can we find ways to at least get the athlete involved in the process of, let's say tournament schedule? Okay, well, okay, so it's April right now. What tournaments are coming up? What's coming up in May? What's coming up in June? Let's instead of the parent telling their kid what tournaments to play or what tournaments they think is best, can we have this be a little bit more of a discussion, right? Can the kid understand where their parent is coming from? Can the parent understand, how the kid feels about playing in maybe certain types of tournaments, whether that's playing higher or lower level tournaments, whether that's maybe playing up, certain people who are doing well in a certain age group might, let's say it's a 13-year-old, instead of just playing 14 and under tournaments, maybe they play some 16 and under tournaments. Maybe they mix in an 18 and under tournament every so often to get that experience, right? But I think that rather than the 13-year-old, let's just say, just being on the receiving end of that and just saying, oh, well, I'm playing this 18 and under tournament this weekend, can they be involved in that process of understanding why their parent wants them to do that? And of also having their own viewpoint and saying, okay, I've been doing really well. I want to try to push things to the next level. I want to see how my game matches up in some of these higher level tournaments or in some of these, higher age groups or things like that. Or just even understanding sometimes the travel and the logistics and the investment that goes into it as well. I mean, there's certainly a lot of people that are traveling around the country, traveling within their region or traveling around the country for higher level tournaments and again, doesn't mean that the kid needs to be involved in every aspect of that process, certainly, but can they start to understand that process a little bit more? I think one thing it does is it can give them a little bit more appreciation for everything that goes into it on the parents' side, or on the coach's side, or whoever is doing that scheduling and planning. But I think it also helps them because, at some point, the parent's not going to be there. The parent's not going to be holding their hand and making all the decisions for them, whether it's when they get to college, whether it's when they're in whether it's when they're working, whether it's, different areas of life that they will have no choice other than to take responsibility. So I think that, as a junior athlete, being able to take responsibility, being able to make certain decisions and being able to, I don't want to say live and die by those decisions, but being able to live with the consequences of those decisions is really important because they're not that there always is necessarily a right and wrong decision in these situations, but actions have consequences. And, they can maybe be involved in that process of, let's say, understand of deciding what they want to do in terms of training, but also seeing what the consequences of that is. Okay, do we want to train more? Do we want to train less? Do we want to work with this particular coach or that particular coach? Do we want to play at this club or that club? And understand what the consequences of that are. So I think, to me, one of the biggest benefits of this is that as an athlete takes more ownership of the process, they will make mistakes, there will be trial and error, but they can learn from that process and make better decisions next time and be more equipped to make those decisions going forward.
Yeah, and I think you bring up like an uncomfortable thing for all of us is watching the player fail. We in the moment we don't want them to. We want to rescue them. We want to make it go well today, but that could potentially have an effect later on in which they always expect that. And it's almost like when we talk to players about, all right, we want you to play a certain way. Don't worry about winning. We want you to just play this way. And if you lose, you lose, but at least you're doing the right thing. It's so hard, though, to stick with that and not go for the win when you could say push or whatever and get the win. And so what do you value? Do you value winning today versus learning something in the long term that will definitely make you better? And balancing that. So I think it is really hard to do this. But I think you bring up some great points, Josh. The more that we can get players invested in owning the process earlier, and they're probably ready earlier for the most part than we think they are, or certainly ready to be engaged in a more, say, Socratic dialogue. So certainly at younger ages, maybe 10 and under, and of course you have to kind of assess the maturity of each of your players. It's different for everybody. that you might be doing more telling and more doing for them. But that doesn't mean like on the side of you understanding their experience. We've talked many times about how everyone experiences tennis is unique. The more that we as a coach or a parent or sports site coach understand and ask about the player experience, the better we can help them. Because we don't want to be the kind of person who just gives out advice that comes from our experience as if our experience is universal. It is not. Everyone has a unique. And so the more that we're asking questions, all right, how did that feel? How does it feel to be in this situation? How do you feel before a match? And it's not about necessarily giving an answer to whatever they're experiencing. It's just simply about understanding. And then the more that you're engaging in those thoughtful conversations, maybe the more your player begins to understand himself or herself and can start to develop ways of thinking. Because you mentioned like about decisions, Josh. All right, there's the decision to train more. So this is a critical thinking skill in that, all right, we've made that decision. Now let's go to the second order. What are the potential consequences of you training more? Maybe there's less time to do homework. Maybe there's less time to see your friends. Maybe you're going to be a little bit more tired and we need more sleep, right? There are probably some second order consequences beyond just, all right, I'm training more. And these are great opportunities for us as coaches and parents to work with kids on helping them understand impacted decisions, to teach them critical thinking skills, to teach them great ways of making decisions, etc. So I think there's a lot here that we want to be working on in terms of guiding our players to a place, maybe to that end state that I had mentioned earlier, where they can do a lot of these things on their own. So in that podcast with Dan Abrahams, that youth director, the academy director at AFC Wimbledon, talked about a game that I think their under 18 team was playing, and they had two vans going to the game. It was an away game. One van had basically a driver and the majority of the players, and then the second van had all the coaches and some other players. So the second van gets stuck in traffic. The first van arrives at the game, and the players, they don't stand around and wait for the coaches to show up. They set up all the cones, they set up everything, and they go through their normal warm-up. And that's because they had been taught how to do this. They had gone from this athlete center to athlete ownership piece, and they knew exactly what they should be doing in that moment. They knew what was important in that moment. They knew the coaches would arrive someday or at some point. But until that point came, that it was up to them to really start driving what's happening. And now, of course, we don't really have that kind of thing with tennis. Maybe high school tennis or college tennis would be pretty rare that the coaches don't show up with the players. But, could you, if you're a high school coach or a college coach, just sort of sit back and say, all right, gentlemen, ladies, go do it. Run the practice. Get warmed up. Do what you need to do. And let's see how they do. And if they fail, they fail. If they don't, they don't. Then you talk about it and you look at it as a kind of a life lesson. So I think, again, as we, look at how we create this environment, we are kind of like the architects of it. We are trying to bring them along in a progression that allows them to be these great human beings of great character who can, live responsible lives in which they're, responsible for themselves and can make great decisions.
I think that's absolutely true, and I think that's a great story, by the way. And I think that there are a lot of benefits when an athlete can develop that, that responsibility, that ownership of their process. I think that can absolutely, impact other areas of their life, whether that's their behavior in general, whether that's how they act at home, whether that's how they act, whether that's their academics and how they act in school and their approach to their homework and all of that. I think that it really can have positive impacts in a lot of different areas of life because I think I think it leads the athlete to understand that, that action and consequence piece, right? That, okay, this I am not just doing this because somebody told me to. I'm doing this because this is the right decision, and I know, what the consequences of the right decision and the consequences of the wrong decision are. And and I've learned from my past, and I understand that this is really setting me up. And I think it helps an athlete be able to look ahead and think ahead in a certain way as well, right? Where we're not just training for the sake of training. We're training because it's helping us. It's helping us become better players, better people. And I think, yeah, having an athlete really understand that and also understand, okay, let's say it does have to do with our coaching, right? Can an athlete understand, maybe why they would want to make certain decisions as it relates to the coaching that they get or the training that they do? And again, we're not talking about going from 0 to 100 here. We're not talking about going from a place where parents make these sorts of decisions or the coach makes the decisions and the parent and the athlete is out of it to a point where the athlete is deciding everything, right? It's a process, and I think that there is that important step in the process where the athlete starts to get involved in the conversation. And again, this can look different whether it's a 6 year old, whether it's a 12-year old, whether it's a 17-year old, right? And it should, and also not just based on age, but also based on that athlete's level of maturity and experience and level and things like that. But yeah, I think having them at least start to be involved in the conversation rather than, okay, my parent or my parents are making this decision for me. No, this is this discussion. We're all trying to figure out the best possible approach or decision here. I think is a really important step, and I think it helps an athlete understand where the parent is coming from, and helps an athlete start to be able to think some of these things through on their own, which is ultimately the ultimate goal here.
And for coaches, I think this is really important because to be a great coach, I think, is to learn to ask great questions and to treat your players with respect. And this topic reminded me of a story about Carlo Ancelotti, who is he's the current manager of Real Madrid. Real Madrid is one of the top soccer football clubs in the world. And a couple of years ago, they were playing in an important Champions League match. And late in the game, Ancelotti brings together some of his more experienced players and asks their opinion on who they should bring on as subs into the game. And that's not a moment of weakness like, oh, I don't know what to do. That's a moment of strength in recognizing these guys are some of the best players in the world. I would be foolish not to get their opinion. They're also the ones out there on the field experiencing what's going on. And so, this is one of the reasons that Carlo Ancelotti's been so successful in his career is he's able to put his ego aside to involve the athletes in decision making. Now, of course, we're talking about top level, but there doesn't mean we can't have degrees of that at different levels of the sport. The exact opposite would be somebody who just sort of makes all decisions by themselves, say that was my decision, or it's my way or the highway type of thing. But when we see really the best coaches in the world, they're the ones who ask the best questions. They're the ones who give credit to the players when things go well. They'll accept their share of the blame, if not all of it, when things don't go well. Kind of an extreme ownership perspective, very much like the Navy SEAL kind of perspective of there are no bad teams, only bad leaders. And in some ways, we can look at that as, there may be really no bad players or bad students. Maybe just coaches are not up to the challenge, or teachers are not up to the challenge. And so the more that we engage in, and you mentioned earlier, Josh, and I'll let you go into this topic if you want to, this a concept of motivational interviewing as an approach, which a lot of questioning, a lot of sort of reflecting and summarizing. And that can be a great way to work with players because it's less, again, about you telling what to do. Sometimes that's necessary, but it becomes more about bringing that player along as a human being.
Yeah, and I think motivational interviewing is, and people can certainly learn more about this as well. I think is a really interesting and helpful approach where essentially, yeah, the coach is more, the coach or the sports psychology professional or whoever it may be, isn't so much just telling the athlete what to do. Oh, you should do this and you should do that, and if you did this, then then that it would really help you. Instead of that, more so asking questions, more so trying to see things from the athlete's perspective, trying to understand where they're coming from, and more so the idea that they can, over time, solve some of these questions, some of these challenges on their own through trial and error, that they can learn and, figure out how they want to operate on their own rather than them being told and that being the better approach that they can go through sort of a natural learning process. And I actually, to me, it also relates to a concept from the book Inner Game of Tennis, which we've talked about in the past. And Tim Galloway, the author, he talks about how when a child or when a baby is learning to walk, it's this takes place in a certain way, right? It's not generally. It's not that the parent is saying, "Okay, you put your left foot in front, and then you rotate your body, and then you move your right foot in front of your left foot, and then you bring your left foot in front again." Generally, it's the baby trying over and over again to walk. And what happens? They will take a couple steps and they'll fall and they'll get themselves back up and they'll try it again and they'll do it again. And there's that natural process of learning to walk through that trial and error. And Tim Galloway talks about, at no point during this process are we saying, oh, you should be walking by now. What are you doing? Look at some of those other, uh, the other people your age that are already walking, or, criticizing or things like that. Just, letting somebody come to that sort of learning process on their own, letting them develop that skill on their own. And I think what we're saying here is that skill, it really is in many ways a skill to be able to take ownership, to be able to make decisions and and learn to live with those decisions and the consequences of those decisions. Um, and I think just being able to, yeah, to really take ownership rather than constantly being told what to do, is just a really important step in an athlete's development process. And as we've talked about, I think can have ramifications and positive consequences within their tennis game and within some of these different areas of their game because they're taking responsibility. They're taking responsibility. They're taking ownership and better understanding, what that leads to, and that can, I think, lead to a lot of really positive things.
And I think this is not necessarily easy to do, this kind of transition from telling and directing to having players own things more and being, I think being curious. I have to remind myself literally every single morning to be better at asking questions and not just telling people what to do. I think, even in our jobs, Josh, there's a certain level of education that we have to go through in teaching certain things, maybe like how to do imagery and working on those skills. We might teach a little bit about, what's the coach's voice like? What are some things there? We teach some things around focus. But then a lot of it has to come back to, can we be curious about how the athlete experiences these things when they go try them? and then work within, the parameters of their answer to help them more. And so one of my favorite professors at the University of Missouri was this guy named Dr. Brandon Orr. So he's a former football player at the University of Michigan and super thoughtful guy. And you look at him and you're like, wow, this guy is like this high level teaching guy. You wouldn't think so. He just sort of looks like a wrestling guy. He's really short and stocky, but super thoughtful. And I saw him speak at Sports Psych Conference back in 2018. He was working with one of his graduate students about um, ways of coaching, like kind of new active ways of coaching athletes. And it was all about asking questions. You might teach something, or you might help an athlete discover a technique. And then it's all about, all right, how did that feel? Tell me how that felt. Okay, what might make it feel better? And none of it was really directing. And you brought up inner game of tennis, for Tim Galway, it was never about telling either. It was all about modeling. And so they actually did this conference, they did something where we paired up and we had to work with a partner on figuring out a way of doing something that worked for the individual. There was no right way, but the activity they gave us, every person sort of had to figure out what worked for them. And then the other person was like coaching them through, all right, how did that feel? What felt right about that? All right, let's do it again now, like with that little discovery. And so motivational interviewing and getting athletes to own things is really getting them to inquire with themselves what's working, what's not working. How do I fix this problem? How do I now experience this in an optimal way? And I think the more that we can be working with athletes through questions, the better. And as I said earlier, I bet athletes are ready for this type of approach earlier than you think they are. And they may surprise you, right?
I would definitely agree, and I think again talking about the inner game of tennis. So I saw this approach firsthand, and people can also look up Tim Galloway on YouTube. I believe it was 60 Minutes. I could be wrong here, but there was a big time show that Tim Galloway was interviewed on, and essentially he taught a complete beginner, someone that I believe had never touched a tennis racket. And within maybe 10 minutes or so, if you can believe it, they were, to some extent, hitting the ball back and forth, going at some sort of a rally. And he used a couple simple techniques, things like bounce hit, which I know we've discussed, which is a great tool to essentially sort of, clear your mind and direct your focus towards one point, which is the ball ultimately, and saying bounce as the ball bounces and hit as you hit it. But I worked with Sean Brawley for a summer, and we this was the summer of 2015 out in Stamford, Connecticut. And Sean worked with Tim Galloway for many years, and they coached together. I think Tim was a mentor for him, and Sean really developed developed his own approach, but I think took a lot from what he had learned from Tim and the inner game of tennis approach. And what I learned from Sean, and really what I saw from him doing teaching and tried to incorporate aspects into my own teaching style or coaching style at the time, is really what we're talking about. Is rather than telling, rather than saying, okay, on the forehand you need to do this with your wrist, and you need to get your racket back at this point, and you need to have this certain follow through and do this with your footwork and all of these pieces, which are important aspects of hitting a tennis ball in an effective way. Rather than that being the focus, there was a lot more of the other side of things. There was a lot more questioning. There was a lot more saying, okay, how did that feel? Okay, did that feel natural? Did that feel relaxed? A lot more watching and sort of modeling rather than constantly talking, rather than constantly telling. More so asking questions, more so the modeling process of just helping a player more so find their stroke or find their game on their own, and sort of helping to lead them in that journey rather than rather than telling them that this is the way that it ought to be done or should be done. And I think what we're saying, or at least an aspect of what we're saying, is, I think parents and coaches have a lot to offer and a lot to give, and certainly make a lot of sacrifices for their kids. And I don't think anyone is questioning that, and I think it's important to recognize that. And sometimes it's parents who have tennis experience or different athletic experience, and they can use that as a tool, as a resource to really try to help. I think what we're saying is to, how can we help to shift the dynamics in a certain way so that an athlete is really able to take ownership, so that they can, find so that they can do some of this learning on their own, so that they can learn from their process, so that they can see what's working and what isn't for them, so that they can, I know I've said the words trial and error a lot, but so that they can go through that sort of a process of learning, of figuring out what works, rather than just being told this is what you should do, this is what's best, right? And again, it's always context dependent, it always depends on the circumstances, but I think, yeah, trying to move a little bit in that direction, trying to have that as the ultimate goal, can really help an athlete to to develop and mature in a lot of different ways.
And I think that's a really great way to kind of wrap it up, Josh. That's really what we're trying to communicate, and ultimately, the environment that we create around the player is what will help deliver that or not. And the more that we have that mission in mind, then the easier this all becomes. So, great conversation. Thank you for engaging in that today. And that's our show for today. Thank you all for listening. For more on today's episode, please check out the show notes. If you have any feedback or questions for me and Josh, please email us at tennisiqpodcast@gmail.com. Also, if you're enjoying the content that Josh and I discuss on the show, please rate and review the podcast so other tennis enthusiasts can find it more easily. Additionally, to be notified of new episodes, please subscribe to the show on your podcast platform of choice, including YouTube. You can also check us out on Instagram. If you would like to support the podcast, please visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/tennisiqpodcast/membership, where you can learn about the benefits of being part of the Tennis IQ podcast community. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon in our next episode.